Good morning. Welcome. This is Angela Coulter, your Consciousness Transformation Ascension Guide, originator of Trinity Energy Progression, bringing you this week's Living the Shift. So, yeah, I've been on a couple of week hiatus in which it just sort of happened. And I had been away for a week of that actually both ends, both Thursdays, because I went Thursday to Thursday. And we did what we call a deep dive weekend. And so I did that with my partner on Ascended World, Sarah C. Gavagnoni, and we had some people, and we did, what we call a deep dive weekend, which is really getting into some really deep cracks and crevices, and um, it's a really focused immersion kind of weekend where we can look at things. So, what happens when I hold or I'm part of holding something like that, when I do my retreats, my immersion retreats, when we do these kind of deep dive weekends, is that there's just as much of a collective perspective to look at versus just what the individuals come to the table, which is what I always say. Whoever shows up is perfect because we have some kind of complement, something we've agreed to, or something we know is vibrationally resonant, that connects us all together. And that's why we end up being there. And I just hold the space and it sort of, flows out on itself. So this one was really interesting in the way that it brought up some unexpected perspectives. And, usually we're working very focused on what we believe are things that hold us back individually and whatever. And it tends to be not necessarily more practical, but more not practical. Yeah, more down to earth. I say that, but then I live in a different in a different, I guess, understanding of reality than many anyway. So to me, what is normal is probably not normal for many others. But if you're watching, there's a piece of it that you're a part of too. So you would understand. So my guidance was to talk about this today, because it is a very different, interesting perspective, and we have a lot of questions when we work in consciousness about our memories of things like Lemuria and Atlantis and other kinds of civilizations, other vibrational civilizations where we have peaked, or we are in quite a bit more remembrance, while still being in separation and stuff like that. So we we went to, like, what happened was, like, several weeks or a week before that particular the deep dive weekend, I actually did an energy share with a friend of mine, and we were talking about whatever going on with both of us, which, as always, is a reflection on each other. And we always have this particular friend of mine, we have very similar experiences, very parallel universes, and stuff like that. So we were working on a particular problem, or not problem, something we would like to improve and open up. And so we both go out there, and what we do is we do a joint energy share where we both go out together, and we both go out with the same intention, and we know we cover it for both of us, and it gives us different perspectives, right? So very unexpectedly, this experience brought me, like, into this place, and it was a very distinctly vivid experience that I can say, like, afterward, when I sort of felt it out, I was like, this is really the handful of times that I've not purposely or consciously purposely bilocated and had some others know that I was there and stuff like that, right? So it was that kind of feeling where all of a sudden I'm like, okay, we just sort of landed someplace, and I was really confused, and I was like, well, what is that? What is this? And she and I were in this place, and it was very familiar, very home, very, very supported and loving and all that kind of stuff. And I looked around and I'm like, oh, I know this. This is Atlantis. And it was so immediate and just so, like, but it wasn't like it was in the past. It was like right now. And I looked around, and there are others around me, in different being states. And they're just like, well, we're happy you're back. Or not happy you're back. You're back. So you're obviously ready for this. And we went through this thing about, spliced DNA. I mean, it does, it sounds a bit woo woo, but I do like allow all these perceptions because it ends up helping us get to a certain point. So, yes, got this piece of the spliced DNA back, right? So I spent a week with that integration. She and I both spent a week with that integration before I went and did that deep dive weekend. So it was interesting is that I didn't tell the group anything about that. I told Sarah, who was doing the thing with me. She and I did it, and we had talked about all that. And we go into it. And so the deep dive weekends, what we do is a form of hypnosis. It's like a guided meditation hypnosis. And it's very deep, and we've been doing it amongst Sarah and I and Yasmin, another person, for the last year and a half. We do it quarterly, and we've been doing these. Now we did it with others, and it really hits on some really deep things that shakes up our whole realities, shakes up our consciousness to shift us, so to help us shift ourselves so we can move forward. So that was the intention of the deep dive. So we go to the deep dive, we go through the first day. We start doing sessions on the individual participants, or with the individual participants, of doing the deep dives. And one thing that just kept on coming up, even though I hadn't talked about it, was Atlantean, very Atlantean energy. Like we would take them to a place and they'd start describing very much something similar to what I had seen in that experience. Good morning, Gloria. So, so I'm like, okay. And I'm noting this because this is what I've been entrained to understand, is looking at, a lot of the work I do is at the collective level. And so I'm looking at collective stuff, and Sarah and I do that with our Ascended World podcast on Mondays. And it just, because collective level consciousness is applicable to each of our individuals in whatever unique filters we have, right? So everybody, without me talking about that experience I'd had the week before, everybody's having like at least one doorway they went through that was very Atlantean. And I was like, so what is there to look at there that's coming up that's important for this weekend? Because obviously, if it came up now, there's something to look at a collective level that will hit each of us on the personal level. So, we're talking about really getting past our deepest challenges, setbacks, our deepest limitations, and things like that. And I'm like, so how can that really be related, right? And people were going to Atlantis to remember certain things. Everybody had a different thing, or to go get something that they had left there. Very reminiscent of the experience I had the week before. And so what came up, and it was interesting because what happens is when I get into these weekends and we get immersed like that, it's like things start rolling, and then it's like I never turn off. Like, and it's like not that I ever turn off, but it just gets like the consciousness, the visions get bigger, and understandings get bigger and bigger and bigger, like a cumulative thing. So I was, in bed, or I got up, I would meditating like the next morning and say, okay, so what is the common thread? Why is this showing up? Give me, I'd set myself up to have the conscious understanding. And then I went out there, and I was back there, and somebody had, so like different people had seen different parts of that whole Atlantean kind of energy. One being like one side of it being very homey and beautiful and just crystalline and gorgeous in its love base and all that kind of stuff. And then the others look at the fall, what we consider the fall of it, the collapse of it, the things that we regret about it. And I was just very puzzled because I've never really looked too closely at the delineation. I've never looked too closely at the different parts of it. Or my chair is popping down. Okay. I'm like suddenly sinking down, sinking into the ocean. So I'm looking at that. And then I saw something that was so distinct and clear. And it was being like I was showing myself, or seeing from this really high level of perspective, that was where we created a split that we didn't I don't want to say didn't anticipate. It was an intentional split, but then it created sort of like the creation of the set of dimensions, which was a much lower density of separation and all that kind of stuff, which then created what like so what started rolling out was this understanding. Then like the more we talked about it and sat in it as a group, the more we started seeing it's like, well, so the collective ego. So it turns into the collective ego. Well, this is what I got in this meditation. And we created this, and it's not that the ego had never been created, it's that we created the ego as it is in this set of dimensions to be dense. And in the density of this creation, we created all of the sorrow and pain and blame and shame and like depths of it, and a whole environment to propel and learn and create through it, right? And in that, we created, like I said, pain, judgment, sorrow, lack, all that kind of stuff, like to in a way that we hadn't before. And when I saw it, it was like almost like I saw this thing suck out and create this. It was almost a spherical thing, and I was like, oh, so that's what we created the Earth dimensions with to explore. Because I've always called it the Earth experiment, and many people I know who've been out there and had the visions, they've called it the Earth experiment too. And I was like, oh, and that is what we created, what I call the Earth Project. And so I said, well, that's really interesting, because when you look at it that way, then the collective ego really is what we consider like the Matrix, right? So if you've seen the movie The Matrix, and if you haven't, you definitely need to at least the first one to get the idea. And some say that The Matrix is actually a documentary versus a, in ways versus a movie. But it all is in one way, shape, or form. So we started looking at that as a group, because I said, okay, this is what came in. And what also came in is, well, then that would be that this collective ego that we created, aka what's become the Matrix, which has created everything through separation at this level of density. All of these identities that we call ourselves here, that are really just part of this collective ego, right? That is really just a part of where we are in what we call Atlantis, which is just a different set of dimensions, which of course our expanded consciousness is a part of, as well as in many others, right? And this is just the Matrix filter that we're like seeing through and experiencing through and whatever. So I said, it's funny, because like this is gonna, this could cause a lot of, ruckus to like be considered. But when we see it that way, the ego, the collective ego that was created to create the Earth experiment at this level of density, which then created again pain, doubt, and all that kind of stuff. Because really, what we were getting together, what the theme was for most of us, for the group in this deep dive weekend, had to do with trusting ourselves, trusting our power, trusting our divinity, trusting our infinite abilities. And everybody came to the table, and that was really a commonality is, well, I don't trust myself. I don't trust my power. I don't trust my guidance 100%. I don't trust all this other stuff. And so when we were talking about that, and I'm like, okay, so we don't trust because we created distrust. We created the need to trust, or this lack or externalization through this creation, the ego that created the Earth dimensions, which in many cases, if you look at it, is what many consider in belief systems to be God, which is actually the Matrix, which blew a lot. Like it's like, wow, we had to really sit with that. And it's like, well, but if you look at it, it makes so much sense. Creation of guilt and doubt and anger and judgment and pain and all that, and learning through that, propelling through that or whatever. And we created doubt. So therefore, it's the nature of being in the Matrix, right? And like, it's like many are starting to use that term, but it's the nature of being in these dimensions. But if we want to personify it and call it the Matrix, right? Or God, because we're within that. But we're beyond that, right? So because we're outside of it, watching ourselves within it, watching ourselves in this level of density and forgetfulness or whatever, to play these games, because all of this is all, from a expanded consciousness that we are tapping into more and more as we let this matrix start to fade away, which would be then that completion of this part of the experiment. And wow, what an adjustment to look at our entire belief system differently, because beliefs all were created this way too. And also the realization, which we knew, but it was like coming to a different level, is that, well, we do exist already in Atlantis. Atlantis is just another set of dimensions, or what we call Atlantis is another set of dimensions, where we already exist, and we're creating this reality from projecting it into, projecting ourselves into, right? Creating the individuality through that collective ego and all of the facets of beautiful, infinitely faceted set of creations that we've done. But in looking at that, it's really an empowerment to realize, yeah, I mean, we talk about it's all an illusion. We've had that perception when we work in consciousness. And we say, okay, well, there's no difference between you and me because we're the same. We are the same. We're not only the ego, the collective ego that was created here as an identity in itself, but we're the expanded consciousness beyond that created that to begin with. And so we have the power, we created it, and that puts us back into a place of being able to say, if I'm in the power of creating it, of having created it, of course, then I can just change it, which is sort of what I did going back to that session that I did, the energy share that I did with a friend of mine, where we went there. And that's why it was so funny, because it was like a breath. And I've had this experience many times over the years where it was like a breath of going home, and such relief, and let me take a breather, let me take a little vacation when we were out there. And I was having this, and I said, it's this communication, and it started happening from then. And it was like, we want to call things light language or this or that or whatever. And I've always said, no, I feel like when we try to even call it anything, we start to flatten it out, and it loses its perception of what it really is. Good morning, Anne. And so when we when I truly can when I tap into that discussion, that communication, that experience, it was very, for lack of any terminology that we can use, it was a holographic form of communication where there was not words or sounds. It was all and nothing. And I basically understood through wholeness, through whole impressions of knowing. And so I was like, okay, so one of my integrations after that whole experience had been for the week before I went and held the deep dive weekend with Sarah and Yasmin, was, I don't know why my chair keeps on going down today. This is really funny. I'm like, why am I singing? Was, how to allow the communication via this holographic form of understanding, right? Of remembering, because that's really much more pure than trying to use words or even a specific kind of energy or a sound or, illustrations. And it's almost like as we're coming to this completion of this earth experience, what I call the earth experiment, we are coming to a place of remembering in that, like that we can, I just lost that train of thought. That every single one of us, as we've known, but it's like looking at it from a completely different perspective, every single one of us has a piece of the whole, right? Because none of us really exist. None of us really exist. These are just illusions of separation that we created through this density, right? And we've known that. But when we look at it as, we're looking at it as this huge expanded consciousness that's still in some forms of separation outside of this set of dimensions that we created, the matrix, so to speak, right? This collective ego that many want to call God or whatever. Then we realize that we're all like the same thing, saying things, communicating things in the piece of the hologram that makes it whole, that brings it whole, right? And when we trust that this is just the illusion that we've created, and that we trust that, you and I are truly the same. And what's really funny is ever since I've sort of gotten that holographic communication that I can't even explain, except that, like, I keep on getting it when I go out in meditation and stuff like that. It is like I look into people's eyes and all I see is me, in a way that I've never done before. Like I had already, but it's like in this way in my heart that I see so deeply, and it's like, wow. And I can see that the piece. So here's the thing. If every one of us brings, and I've always said that every one of us is here to play our note, right, in this symphony. Meaning, here's the thing. We have created, meaning I, right? We did this group session in the deep dive weekend where I talked about, where we were talking about, we remember, I can't remember what the intention was, but then it was like, okay, we remember. And when I went out there, it was like, yes, we remember. I remember, because there is only I of that collective ego. That is a creation of our expanded knowing consciousness beyond that in Atlantis or wherever else. There's so many other parts of the multiverse, which is all then part of this even bigger consciousness. So it was overwhelming for many, but it also helped to set a stage for acceptance, to trust that we've got this, because there's nothing we can't get. We're the creators and we're the players. And when we say, well, we've created all these facets, and when I saw, so then there was one point in the weekend, which was really funny. I hadn't intended on this at all, because we had done sessions on ourselves before we did the weekend with the participants. In the middle, like the second day after we had talked about this and we had a day to process all of it, I was like, yeah, I'm getting really strongly that I need to get there and you need to take me. Like, do the hypnosis session on me or whatever. And I went as not me. I went as, although I had said, make me stay me, because I tend to jump right into this expanded state of consciousness when I go through a state like that. And I said, but then I was like, no, when I was going through the process, I understood, no, you have to leave yourself at the door, because this is for everybody. This is the collective thing. And it was all about, what was it now? I have to go back and listen to I have to listen to the audio. We recorded all of them, but it had to do with, what was it about? I don't know if Sarah, if you're on here, help me. But I was guided to say it's for me to go in, like, do me on this or whatever. So we did a session, and it was this collective thing about getting into, to see things from that perspective, and seeing the power through that. And as we are creating, it's time for us to, the full notes. That's it. It has to do with that. Oh, duplicity. Yeah. Sorry. I'm talking to my own guidance here on the air. This is a little different than I usually do on my Living the Ships. Yes, it was this. I saw the entire Earth experiment, and I saw that every individual facet that we have created in the Earth experiment, including myself and everybody else, so there's a part of us from the outside, the expanded consciousness, like say in Atlantis or wherever, that we sent in seeds when it was, time, that are not of this collective ego, but they've come in to sort of like spur off seeds of like a remembrance thing. And we created sort of what we call a cheat code. Like if you look in a game, like a video game, and see this chair is dropping again. It's a brand new chair too. That's very funny. Maybe I need to lock it. So I saw it was sort of like playing a video game and getting a cheat code. And so, yes, I just got it, Sarah. Thanks. It took me a minute to get there. I was like, I'd seen it, and then it popped out. It was like getting a cheat code where we had a pattern, and it was so fascinating to see there was this whole pattern. It was almost like a code, right? that we had implanted here to be able to get to this next, to dissipate it, to get to another creation or whatever. Like, doesn't even matter. And we all brought in these seeds from outside the ego matrix, kind of thing, to create yeah, to have the code ready to play in the perfect pattern. And it's not that ever like, and there is plenty of duplicity, and it was brilliant to see it. And it's like, I trip up in trying to explain it because it was just brilliant to see and remember and going, oh, that's right, we did this. And there's no like, oh, what if we don't do it? We have so many doubts about like whether we'll be able to complete and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it doesn't matter. We have so much duplicity that the pattern will come together perfectly as we have set it to do. And so there's no reason not to trust. So this brings me full circle into talking about trusting. And it's funny because we've had all these things and we get lost in the romanticism of Atlantis. We get lost in and I'll tell you, when I went there in that session, it was not just a memory. It was by location because it was so vivid. That's why I was so disoriented. And even my friend, and when we came back, though she hadn't seen it, she had gotten some words and she was like, wow, what was that? Because the energy was transformative. And she's like, and I didn't want to come back. And I'm like, yeah, well, this is what I said. She goes, oh, that, yeah. And the words that she heard or got were very in alignment with what we'd seen. It was like being home, like, oh, it was like, it was like, being on a deep dive in a scuba gear and then like getting to, come out and breathe for a while, like fresh air without like having all the contraptions. And it's like, okay, but that's what it was like. It wasn't like, it was a memory. It was like, no, okay, I'm stepping out of the movie for a minute. I'm stepping out of the Matrix for a minute. And if you watch the Matrix, you know what I'm talking about. And it's like, okay, let me just be this. And when it was time to go back and they were like, yeah, okay, it's time to go back. And I was like, okay. But it wasn't like just me. It was such a collective thing. And ever since that happened, like I said, I look into people's eyes and I see myself. And because there's nothing but, and it's so clear, so much even clearer than it ever was before. And so part of that is to know that if we have that of course, we have that kind of assurance in there. We knew when the whole project was going to be done and, or is done, or as we're watching it. And many had seen, Sarah even saw like a control center in subsequent sessions. And it's so many pieces and they come together because we all have a piece of it. That's why we're created in facets. That's why we have the duplicity. That's, I talk about being notes in the symphony, and for us to be our full note is to just be playing out our part in the pattern, our part in the cheat code for us to finish this up, to let it be complete, and with glory and gratitude and beauty and love and everything else, so that we then move to what is the next creation, or actually just use from this what we are using in another creation. So that's just a couple of things to think about. And like I said, this is a very different perspective, or the different, and it's not that I don't see things this way, it's that I don't typically talk about them this way when I get on the air. But my guidance was to actually get on here and talk about it today, and here I am. So sit on that, go into your meditation, whatever your practice is, set yourself to have conscious clarity on understanding on that and how it affects you. When we anchor in the essence of remembering that we are those creators, the creators of the collective matrix, right? The God that we believe in many cases, in many belief systems, exists. That is something that we actually created. And so these individual facets of ourselves are just little pieces of this whole that we have access to all of it. It's like being this really free, like it's funny how we've created computers and technology to reflect how we, are in many ways. So allow yourself to tap into that, to the essence of that knowing and that remembering, and that I am that we are that. We and I are interchangeable from that perspective. And to say, okay, well, then we created it. Let's just change it. Let's do it differently. And if I'm here to just be this note or to carry out my particular piece of the code, right? Then let me just have fun doing it. And why do I have to worry? Why do I have to distrust or doubt or whatever? And just sit in a state of love. And the more we infuse love into the density of separation and wholeness, the more we infuse love and wholeness into the density and separation, the faster it resolves. And then we don't have to do anything because we've gotten mired down in those details of doing. And doing was created here too in that way. So, a lot to consider. So sit in that in your meditation and journaling and reflection and see how that feels, like really deep into the cells, because it's something we hold and we know, we just have forgotten because that's part of what we created as the game. And see what shifts for you in terms of trust and peace. And after the ego has a temper tantrum, which it might, and says, oh, this can't be true, this is ridiculous, blah, 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 this is, nonsense, or that could never be. And like, the more you're triggered, the more it's important to look underneath. And that I've said about anything, in terms of the work I do. So sit with that and see what feels. And then if you can get past all that, what feels good about that, and home, like home and pure and a space of love and wholeness. So on that, I'm going to let you go. Thank you for joining me. Have a great week. We'll see you next time. This is Angela Coulter signing off with this week's Living the Shift. Bye.